Yep. Today we finished Descartes. We got through most of it last time, but we got cut off, I think, towards the end of the wax example, and we didn't really get through the wax example completely. So we'll recap a little bit. We'll get through that wax example and see what he's trying to do here with the wax. What was his point? How is this supposed to support his rationalism? And then we'll get to his proofs for God. Because remember, we're stuck in this sort of skeptical corner at this point. He still hasn't told us why we should claim to have any knowledge. If there's an evil genius or an evil demon tricking us, deceiving us, making us think they were here when we're not, well, he exists, but thinking that what we're seeing is real when it's not, then I can't really have any knowledge of anything but myself. And so I've got to go beyond that. I want to know more than that if I'm a philosopher. I don't want to be a total skeptic. So he thinks if he can prove God's existence somehow, that this will get rid of that evil genius for him, right? Because if God exists, God's good, he wouldn't allow this massive deception to take place, right? So that's where the proofs for God come in. And after that, we'll talk a little bit about Descartes' metaphysical position, dualism. I'm not going to say a whole lot about it, but just to compare it to the other rationalists. So we'll talk about, to a small extent, we'll talk about Spinoza and Liveness, two other rationalists. So they agreed with Descartes on many points, especially in their epistemology. Knowledge comes from reason. It's not something gained through experience. But they were distinct, right? They had some disagreements with Descartes. So we'll go over those in a little bit after we finish Descartes. And then later on, we'll get into the British empiricists. We might say a little bit about Hume by the end of class, but I don't want to give you too many details because your next reading response is going to be over Hume. Well, it's going to be a little different. It's actually over Hume and Descartes. So you've got a bit of a head start on it. By the end of class today, we'll have finished our focus on Descartes. So you'll have that already under your belt. But when you go to your reading response in the next day or so, it's due next class, I'd like you to sort of compare the two, talk a little bit about both, but really just focus on the one that you agree with and tell me why you agree with them, right? So the wax example is sort of Descartes' argument, or one of his arguments, for why our knowledge must rely on reason. The reason is really what explains our knowledge and why we have it. But then, of course, there's Hume's claim that no, this is not the case, that all knowledge originates in my experience, right? So we'll talk, maybe if we have time, a little bit about Hume's argument, and that's what you'll write about on your next response. So with all that being said, does anybody have any questions or concerns? No? Okay, well, speak up if you do in the middle of the lecture. So again, to recap, Descartes wants to know what he can know, right? And he wants to set up a nice, rigorous method for accumulating knowledge. Right? He feels that the scientific revolution has shown him that mistakes have been made, that there were some base assumptions that were just that, assumptions, and bad assumptions. And so we've got to sort of start from scratch and get rid of all of our knowledge, start from a blank slate, and he pretty much has succeeded at creating this blank slate with his evil genius hypothesis, or evil demon, I think, is in your textbook, right? If I have this evil demon looking over me, controlling everything I do, and creating all these illusions, then I can pretty much doubt everything, right? Well, of course, there's one thing I can never doubt. What was that? Yeah, his own existence, right? By the mere fact that he's doubting, he must exist, right? So, I think therefore I am, right? His famous cogito, ergo sum, a famous one line from Descartes. But we want to know more than the I, right? We want to know more than the cogito. We want to know that there's something beyond just myself that exists. Otherwise, we're stuck in this solipsism, right? That's what solipsism is. It's sort of this belief that all I can know for certain is my own existence and nothing besides that. Now, he doesn't want to be that way, but he sort of he takes a little detour through the wax example before he clears up these issues completely. He's going to tell us how I can have knowledge of the objects that I see, the physical objects that I see, because it seems like I have a more distinctive grasp short list. When we talk about the body and describe the body, we can go into all sorts of detail, right? And so it seems like we have a more distinctive grasp on the physical things, even though they're more doubtful. So I think this is perhaps why Descartes turns to the wax example at this point, to kind of show us exactly what our knowledge of the physical thing consists in. Where does it come from? And we already went through this, but let's just quickly recap, right? He's got a honeycomb. He takes it. It's got a certain color to it. It's got a shape. It makes a noise when he hits it. The smell of the honey is still on it. And he puts it by the fire. And what happens to all of those qualities? They all change. They all alter, right? Everything about it that made it so obvious to the senses. There was a distinct thing. All of this has changed. So we still want to say it's the same wax, but why can't we do that if we just rely strictly on our senses?
Senses have changed. It's no longer solid. It's melted. It's
Right. Whatever my senses told me, right? Whatever my nose told me at the beginning, whatever my eyes were telling me, all of that information has changed. And so if I was just going with my senses, not using what Descartes calls my understanding, right? Not reasoning about it and coming up with an understanding of it. If I would just rely solely on the senses, I'd have to say it was a different object because the qualities have all changed. In fact, it must have been a different object at every moment of the change. Right? Any type of qualitative change means the object itself has changed. But Descartes says, well, we know that's not the case. It must have been the understanding, though, that arrived at this, not our senses. Okay? It couldn't be our imagination either. He distinguishes this from our understanding and from our reason. Imagination. So why does he say, I didn't arrive at my knowledge of the wax through my imagination? Why not? Well, there are certain things that I know about the wax. I might ask you the question, how many different shapes could the wax take? How many different shapes could I shape it into? Whatever I want. So what's that? Infinite, right? An infinite amount of shapes, right? Well, how do you know that? How do you know? Do you know that because you saw it? You saw it change into an infinite amount of shapes?
You have an understanding.
I have an understanding of it, but I didn't arrive at that understanding through my senses, obviously. Because if I did, I would have to have seen it change an infinite amount of times.
I guess you used your imagination to come to an understanding that you can change it.
He doesn't think that's the way you did it either, because he thinks that it'd be the same thing, basically. You'd have to imagine every possible shape. You have to say, okay, well, I could shape the wax like a pyramid. I could also shape it like a
Slanted pyramid.
Yeah, I was just going to go there. A pyramid with one notch on the side, a pyramid with two notches on the side, a pyramid with three notches on the side, right? Oh, maybe a sphere, or a pyramid that's kind of flattened, all right? Did I sit there and imagine every possible permutation of the wax? No, that would have taken an infinite amount of time. I used reason, right? I used my understanding. So part of my knowledge of the wax, in fact, the whole of my knowledge of the wax, according to Descartes, certainly comes from my reasoning, my ability to reason, my ability to understand things, not from my imagination, certainly not from my senses. So if I'm going to be analyzing physical objects, he thinks, I want to be very suspicious of the senses. I want to be guided throughout the process with my reasoning ability. This is where knowledge originates for him. But I can't have knowledge of the physical things as long as I got this nasty evil genius hanging over my head, an evil demon. So we've got to get rid of that somehow. We've got to prove that there couldn't be one of these nasty demons haunting me my whole life. And how do we do that? Well, again, we prove God. Okay, so he gives us a few proofs. I'm just going to go over a couple. One of them is already written on the board. I think I'll save this one for last. The first proof I'll go over, it's known as the mark of the craftsman. Some people give that nickname to this argument, the mark of the craftsman. I guess the idea is that God leaves a mark on us, a mark like the mark of the craftsman. When a blacksmith forges something like a sword or a shield, they'll put a little stamp on it, and And so I guess that's where this name comes from. Descartes says, well, look, he's thinking about God, and he realizes, well, geez, I have this distinct idea of God, and it's a very unique idea. Where could I ever have come up with this idea? Could I have come up with the idea of God on my own? No, he thinks. I couldn't have done it on my own. Why not? Well, Descartes says, I'm not perfect, of course. I'm human, so I have faults. And I'm not infinite either. Okay? I'm a finite being. So Descartes, he reasons, well, look, if I'm finite and I'm imperfect, then how could I have any idea of perfection, of what that is? Where did I get that idea? And how could I have any idea or concept of the infinite if I've never experienced the infinite or seen it with my senses? Well, that idea must be there somehow, because, I'm thinking of it right now, says Descartes. But how did it get there? How did the idea of God get there? Any possible explanation you can think of?
Divine.
What?
Is that where he's leaning? Is that divine?
Well, what is divine? The idea itself? Or the fact that it's there?
The fact that it's there.
Right, the fact that it's there, he says, is sort of like a miraculous thing. Because he thinks it's impossible for a finite being or an imperfect being to really have a clear and distinct idea of perfection and infinity. So, i.e., to have an idea of God. So the idea must have been put there somehow. He couldn't have come up with it on his own. The idea must have been placed there. And it must have been placed there by something that was perfect and infinite. And what falls under that category? God, right? So, God has to exist in order to put the idea of God in my head, because that's the only explanation I can come up with, says Descartes. Any problems with this, you think? This argument? Mark of the craftsman? The idea of God is this innate idea I'm born with. It's like the mark of the craftsman. God puts the idea of himself in my head as sort of like a signature. Hey, by the way, I'm the one that made you. What's that? Different religions? Good. He probably had no idea, but anthropologists, Rene, laugh at this argument. They're aware of several cultures that do not have a conception of God. Now, Descartes might say, oh, well, they're savages, they're not human, or something like this, right? But that's his racist, Enlightenment sort of attitude shining through. But we know that, there's cultures that do live and operate, with religion, but not without this notion of this God, right? That there's maybe like spirits in nature or something like that, but not a monotheistic, perfect, infinite being. So that might be one problem with this argument. Any others? Does Descartes really have the clear and distinct idea of God? Does anybody in here have a clear and distinct idea of God? I don't think so, right? I think you kind of have to be God, right? To really fully understand God. And I think that's what he's going on. Oh, it's just miraculous that I would have a notion and understanding of God. Well, your idea and notion of God is pretty incomplete. It's not anything that you should be running to the bank about, right? Running the bank with. When we get to Hume, I think Hume's got even a more airtight argument against this, but I'll hold off on that because we're going to start on Hume tomorrow. Another assumption that, perhaps might be a bad assumption is that there's no way that something simple could contemplate something more complex than itself. And when we get to Kant, we'll see some of the problems with this, that infinity could be arrived at without having to actually experience the infinite. Okay? So these ideas that we come up with don't necessarily have to be based on being implanted there or on something we've seen or learned. And we'll have to hold off till we get to Kant to get a really good explanation of that. But if you don't like that argument, he's got at least another one or two or three. We're just going to go over the next one, the ontological proof. So that was the mark of the craftsman. This is the ontological proof for God's existence. Ontological, nice fancy word there. Ontology is the study of being. And so ontological proof, having to do with the being of God. So what does it say? And really, I must give credit to St. Anselm. Descartes kind of resuscitated this argument, but it was originally formulated by a man else to be perfect. All perfection is included in God, and so God is the being with every perfection. It's the highest being of all. Second premise, usually it's phrased like this: existence is a perfection, or to exist is a perfection, or it's a part of perfection. In other words, in order to be perfect, what's included in that is existence, right? I have to exist in order to be perfect. If I don't exist, I can't be perfect, right? Is that controversial, maybe? Yeah? Why? What makes you say that? So if I'm perfect, don't I have to exist to be perfect?
Depends how you define perfect.
Okay, right. Well, maybe you might even argue that this is just a vague concept, right? That the perfection itself is something that maybe we're all striving towards it without even really knowing what it is completely. That it's sort of a vague and sort of nebulous concept. Okay, but he's going to say that because of 1 and 2, the conclusion has to follow, right? Because God is the being that has every perfection, and to exist is a part of that, God must exist then.
By your logic, yes.
Yeah, if 1 and 2 are true, the conclusion does have to kind of be true. Although, I don't know, it might not be quite valid, though. I mean, if you think about it, in order for the first premise to be true, what else would have to be true? God would have to exist, right? So in order for this to be true, God would have to exist. Well, what are you trying to prove? That God exists. So you've got a premise that's supposed to establish God's existence, and that premise itself relies on God's existence for its truth. So you've got a bit of a circular argument here. You know, it's sort of trying to pull itself up by its own bootstraps, to use an old expression. Right? So, I mean, a lot of people, you know, even logicians, they kind of laugh at these arguments. Oh, this doesn't work. And it might give you the idea, the impression that Descartes was sort of a sloppy philosopher, not that sophisticated. I think we mentioned this last time. He wasn't really that concerned so much with metaphysics. I think he wanted to go do his math problems. He wanted to do geometry and maybe a little bit of natural science. So for him, he's just like, I got to get rid of this evil genius. Let's prove God really quick. Hey, aren't there some good arguments from the medieval period that I can kind of bring up again? And let's just move on, right? So some people just kind of laugh at this. Well, he really thinks he's proven God. Don't think so. He might think that he has, but maybe it's because he's just focused on other things, right? He's got to go and invent analytic geometry or develop analytic geometry. Right? That's got bigger fish to fry. At least he thinks they're bigger fish. We didn't talk a whole lot about Descartes' overall metaphysics. Now, moving on to Continental Rationalism in general, I don't want to get into the details too much, but Descartes, like Plato, he was a dualist, but not in the same sense as Plato, right? Plato advocated a form of dualism in which we have this universe, right, that's divided in half. We've got the intelligible realm on the one hand, and then we have the lower realm, which is the physical, visible realm, right? So we've got these sort of two worlds, and the relation between them, you know, he's not very clear about that, but anyway, the universe is made up of those two levels. Descartes is thinking more along the lines of what you might call substance, right? He's trying to analyze the world in terms of substance, something that really hasn't been done much, at least, until since the pre-Socratics. People like Thales were trying to figure out what is the ultimate substance of the universe. Thales thought it was water, remember? These guys also are asking the same question. What is the substance of the things around us? You know, what are they made of, basically? And Descartes was a dualist in that sense. He thought there were two types of substance. And what are they? Well, one type of substance he calls extended substance. The other one is unextended. Well, what do you think he means by that? If something has extension, what does that mean? If it's extended. Not like I'm going to extend the lecture, like I'm doing that in time, but extension in space.
It doesn't seem like a consciousness.
No, actually, for him, consciousness is unextended, right? Consciousness doesn't actually it doesn't have any extension. Right? So this desk has extension, right?
It takes up space and has quality.
Right, has dimensions, has qualities, right? So extended substance would be things, you know, like my body is an extended substance, right? There's depth to it, dimension. whereas my soul or my mind would be the unextended substance, right? It doesn't take up space, doesn't have any extension to it, but he thinks it exists. So you're right, for Descartes there are two types of substance. That's why he's a dualist. That's why we call him a dualist. He believes in dualism. Two types of substance, extended and unextended. But this brings up this famous problem. It's still a problem today if you take a class at UH in philosophy of mind. I'm sure you'll spend a lot of time talking about the mind-body problem. Well, what is this problem? It's not really a problem unless you conceive of the mind as something that Descartes conceives of as something unextended, right? If you have the same idea that there's this thing called a soul or a mind or a psyche or whatever you want to call it, and it's not a spatial, temporal thing. It's not something that takes up space. It's not physical. It's not tangible. It's something that is completely intangible. If you believe that, and Descartes did, and you also want to insist, as Descartes did, that the mind controls the body somehow. That my mind, I mean, Descartes would admit sometimes our mind is affected by our body. If we get hurt, and we might get emotionally rattled or something like that. If something really devastating happens to us physically, it might affect our mind. But ultimately, Descartes says that the mind is the master of the body. The mind controls the body. The mind tells the body to move its hand around or do whatever, move its arm around. And so the question comes to be, well, how exactly does the mind do this? How is it that the mind, which is not a physical thing at all, according to Descartes, how does something like that move something that is physical? That doesn't seem to really make sense, even given Aristotle's outdated physics, right? Even for Aristotle, for movement to occur, there has to be force, and force means that there's matter or energy of some sort, right, making this movement happen. Now, that can't work for the mind and the body if the mind is not something physical. Or we have to at least explain, how it happens. Any guesses? How does the mind move the body if the mind is not physical and the body is? How does something intangible move something that is tangible?
The way God wanted it.
It's the way, that's kind of, I wouldn't say that's exactly what Descartes says, but he kind of gives us a non-explanation at first. The first person to really point this problem out to him was a woman, I can't remember her full name, but she's known as Princess Elizabeth. She was this duchess. And she would write letters with him. They were friends, and she would read his work and kind of critique it. And she basically said this, look, how does this work? How does the mind move the body if mind is unextended? And his first answer was, oh, you're just thinking too hard about it. It just does. It just does, right? And you just have an innate understanding of it. You should just be able to just innately know how it works. And she sort of just calls BS on him, right? Whatever, right? You're full of it. Well, okay, so if you don't know how he could deal with this, how might a scientist today, what might a scientist say? How does the mind move the body?
Electricity.
Right, you've got these synapses in the brain, right? And whenever and your mind is not really unextended either, right? It's just your brain. It's a physical thing. And yeah, it's just all, your neurosystem, right? All these synapses firing in your brain, sending information through your body, through your nerve, right? Through your spinal column. Okay, well that's a naturalistic example, or a naturalistic explanation of how mind affects the body. And what does that do? It pretty much makes mind a part of the body. It's that's is that based on anything certain for Descartes? Remember, I'm not going to accept anything as true unless it's certain and indubitable. Do you think that lives up to his standard of certainty? No, right? How does he know the soul is located in the pineal gland? What makes him think that? How could he prove this? I think he's not living up to his own standards. I think he's really just trying to come up with an ad hoc explanation. He doesn't know how else to do it, right?
Like the third eye theory or something like that.
Perhaps that might be. I'm not sure, but that might be the origin of the third eye, sort of. Yeah, this idea, right? That's where the real eye that sees all truth is. Yeah, maybe that's an earlier expression that sort of made him biased towards that explanation, right? I don't know. So Descartes' dualism is very problematic, especially explaining the interaction between the two types of substance. Okay. Let's move on though to Spinoza and Leibniz. I just want to say a few things about them, right? Two rationalists, just like Descartes, but unlike Descartes, they were also very religious. It's not that Descartes wasn't religious, but he tried to separate his religion from his science and his religion from his philosophy. In fact, if anything, I think that's probably, besides mathematics and geometry, that's probably his most lasting contribution, I think, to the history of thought. Descartes was very insistent on the separation of religious speculation, religious theory, and scientific theory. That the two should not be the same as they were during the medieval period. But Spinoza and Leibniz, they tended to ignore that part of Descartes. They liked his rationalism, but they both practiced what was called natural religion. And when we get to Hume next class, you'll see just how opposed he was to natural religion. Maybe that's why he wasn't so popular during his own time, because natural religion was a very popular brand of philosophy during Hume's during the time when Hume was writing, late 1700s, right? So, what is natural religion? Well, it's doing exactly what Descartes said you shouldn't do, using science and scientific fact to try to prove theological positions or doctrines. And so, for example, I've never read the article, but I've heard that Leibniz once wrote an article, and he was trying to figure out whether or not transubstantiation would work on the moon. Does anybody know what transubstantiation is? Any Catholics in here? No? No one's ever taken communion? I'm sure there's plenty of people that are raised Catholics. What's that?
No good Catholics.
No good Catholics. Okay. So communion, basically, what is communion supposed to be? What does the Catholics believe?
It's body of Christ.
Right, you're eating the body of Christ and you're drinking the blood of Christ, right? But it doesn't start off as the body of Christ or the blood. It's wine and wafers. So what do they do to make it the body of Christ? They bless it. That's called transubstantiation, right? That process by which, the priests say something over the food and it becomes the body of Christ and the blood of Christ. So Leibniz is wondering, well, if there were people on the moon, which they thought there might be, they didn't know, because this is 1600, 1700. If there are people on the moon, Leibniz asks, and they went to the seminary school and learned how to do transubstantiation, would it be effective on the moon, right? Would it work? Like, would the food actually become Jesus and the blood actually become, or the wine actually become his blood? Leibniz, I think, says no. Why not? Because Jesus died for the sins of the earth, not the moon. Something like that, right? So Hume was like, what are you talking about? Like, even if there were moon people, like, how do you know? These are things you couldn't prove. You can't know these things. Spinoza and Leibniz said, yeah, you can. You can use logic, reason, philosophy, science to prove all this stuff, right? And I gave you kind of a ridiculous example. Leibniz was a much more rigorous philosopher than that example might lead you to believe, right? I mean, Leibniz, along with Newton, were the ones that developed calculus. In fact, there's a big debate in math who exactly developed calculus first, whether it was Leibniz or Newton. I guess we'll never really know for sure. If you ever take a class in calculus, the notation that you'll be using and learning, for the most part, is Leibnizian. But they think that Newton probably, he definitely published his work in calculus first. But some people say that Leibniz's notebooks go back even further. And they were using calculus was doing metaphysics still. And he was trying to explain the nature of this universe with the understanding that the universe was created by a perfect being. And so was Spinoza. They were both trying to do this, right? They're both trying to say, well, how is the universe, what is the nature of it, given that it's created by a perfect being? And unlike Descartes, right, remember Descartes says there's two types of substance? Spinoza and Leibniz, they take a different route. Spinoza's a monist, right? And remember Parmenides, he believed in monism, the one, all that stuff. So what does that mean, monism? Only one substance, right? So for him, there's not two, there's one unified substance. Spinoza was a Jewish theologian too, so he believed in God. So if everything's all one substance, what is this substance? It is God. So this view is not just monism, but it's also known as pantheism. This idea that God is everywhere and is everything, that the universe itself is just God incarnate. So we're all part of God, according to Spinoza. We're all different aspects of God. Except for the real evil demonic stuff. That's just an absence of God. Those are like the holes in the universe where there's just a void, there's nothing. Besides that, the universe is just all God, right? One unified, absolute substance. And Spinoza was seen as a blasphemer and a heretic. Probably not really so much for his monism, but for his insistence that God was determined, right? That God couldn't be otherwise than he is. And they're like, no, God can do anything, so shut up, right? But for Spinoza, no, God has to be a certain way, because that's what perfection is, and you can't change that, right? Leibniz, similar to Spinoza, he believes that there's one type of substance, right? So there's one type of substance, but it's not one unified substance. So there's one type, but there are a lot of them. So the universe is made of the same type of material, but there's a bunch of them, right? He calls them monads, okay? As opposed to a dyad or a triad, right? A dyad of 2 parts, triad of 3 parts. A monad is 1 part. So for him, a monad is the smallest unit possible. So it's kind of like an atom, if you're thinking about physics. And it's indivisible. You can't cut it in half. You can't cut it any smaller. It's the smallest part possible, the monad. It's completely unextended, so it doesn't take up any space. Right? I forgot to put this qualification up there. He says it's windowless. The monad is windowless. It doesn't have any windows. And what does he mean by that? Well, no information goes out, no information comes in. So it doesn't receive anything, and nor does it transmit anything. The monad is this self-sufficient unit. And so what makes monads move? What makes them organize themselves the way they do? If the world is just a bunch of monads that are patterned in a certain way, what makes them do what they do? Well, for Leibniz, all of their movements are pre-programmed into them at their creation. So once the monad is created, it already has a plan in place. It's just fulfilling its plan, fulfilling its essence, as he would put it. And who does the programming, you think? God, right. So the universe is just this vast commingling of monads, and all the movements that we see in the universe are pre-programmed at its creation, at its inception, by God. And really for Leibniz, too, he's going to say the movements aren't real. It's just the appearance of movements, right? In reality, everything's stable and unified. And for him also, it's the best of all possible worlds. That's a phrase that Leibniz is famous for repeating over and over again, that it's the best of all possible worlds. Why is it the best of all possible worlds? Well, it was made by the perfect being. And the perfect being would make the best world that's possible, right? If God could make the world any better, God would have. So Leibniz reasons that it must be the best of all possible worlds. Even though it seems to be a bad world, and there's problems there, for Leibniz it must be the way it is, right? It's all determined by God. So that's the rationalist spin on things. That's Leibniz for you. Let me get a little picture going up here. You know I'm not a great artist, so please take it easy on me. But if we're trying to figure out what is real out there, we're looking at things in the world around us, and we have a certain vision of the things that we see in the world around us. We want to know exactly how close to the truth is that vision of things that we have in our head. So, if I'm looking out at this room and I see these objects, I'm looking at this piece of chalk or this desk, this empty desk that's sitting here, I'm going to see it at a certain angle, with a certain light on it, and I'm going to see it in a certain way, a certain light from a certain perspective. But let's imagine there's a mosquito in here or a fly on the wall that's looking at the same desk that I am. Is the mosquito or the fly, are they going to see the same thing that I see? No, it'll look quite different. So what does the actual desk look like? Is my perception of it closer to the actual desk, or is the fly's perception closer to the actual desk? I want to know what the actual real desk looks like. How do I get there, right? So, this is a problem that both the rationalists and the empiricists are trying to deal with. Let me put that up here, the empiricists. So, we've got two ways of approaching this question, right? British empiricism versus Continental Rationalism, both trying to approach this question. So I'm going to borrow from Wittgenstein, and we'll just say that, look, there's this little cat out there, this cat, look, some whiskers there, kind of looks like a funky cat, little fat cat. There's a cat or a rat or whatever that looks like to you on a mat, right, sitting out there in the world. And here we are, the perceiver. I'm going to put a little profile there. So I'm looking out, I see a cat on a mat. I've got this sort of, my field of vision, something like this. I'm looking at it. And then I've got this picture, right, that I'm perceiving in my mind of the cat on the mat. Okay, so there's an object out there, just like the desk, right, and it has certain qualities about it that are true, that are objectively true. At least this is the argument, right? My perception of it is going to be much different than the fly's perception. Let's just imagine a little speck as a fly looking at it, right? I want to know what the thing in itself is, right? The thing in itself. What are the things in themselves? What is really real? What do the rationalists say? Well, they say, look, this won't work. Especially someone like Leibniz. In your head, you've got a picture in your head. And for Leibniz, that's just not it, right? What is really real for Leibniz? The monads. These things you can't see. They're too small to see. They're indivisible. They're the smallest unit possible. You can't see the monads, but for Leibniz, that's what reality is really made up of. So when I'm looking at a cat on a mat, I'm really looking at a collection of monads, all organized together to look like a cat on a mat. So this picture I have in my head when I'm looking at that cat is far from the truth, says Leibniz. It's too, as he puts it, it's too representational. Leibniz, in the German, keine Vorstellung denken, he says, no representational thoughts. In other words, if I can represent it to myself visually, then it's not true enough, right? I have to have, if I can actually picture it in my head, then it's not abstract enough, it's not general enough, it's not closer enough to that universal truth of the universe. So I don't want to start thinking about the actual visual features of the cat. I want to start thinking about things like catness, right? And matness, right? The quality of being a cat, or the quality of being a mat, or more abstract, right? Something I can't picture. Now, the British empiricists, some people, like Locke, empiricist is how this process works. How is it that we take in information, and what do we do with that information? And particularly for Hume, are we making any mistakes in this process? Because if we are, we need to correct them if we're going to get at any truth. But as far as getting at the thing in itself, sorry, Leibniz, Spinoza, you can't get there. You'll never know what a thing in itself is. I'll never know what the desk is in itself. I just have my perceptions of the desk, and I need to deal with those and explain those. So that's what the British empiricists are up to, right? A rejection of this rationalism, looking for more general ideas and abstract ideas, catness, madness, monads, whatever. They're going to laugh at this. So, moving on. British empiricism, right? I talked a little bit about Berkeley, a little bit about Locke, and maybe even a little bit about Hume before I let you go. And I guess I should have probably told you, why do I call them Continental Rationalists and British empiricists? We didn't really go over that last time. Okay, Continental Rationalism, historically, these group of philosophers are called Continental Rationalists because during the modern period, most of the rationalists were on the continent of Europe, right? Descartes was a Frenchman, he lived in Holland. Spinoza was Jewish, but he lived in Holland. And Leibniz was German. No, but he sure did visit a lot. That was the place to go if you were intellectual during this time period. That was they were much more open-minded about things. And so yeah, living in not just Amsterdam, but Rotterdam and all of these other cities in the Netherlands, or modern-day Netherlands. This was kind of the place to be if you were an intellectual. So most of them were on the European continent, and the British empiricists, for the most part, British Isles. Right? Locke was an Englishman, Berkeley and Hume were Scottish. So what's going on here with the British empiricists? As I told you, they're not interested in the thing in itself. Locke says, the thing in itself, that is something I know not what. That's kind of how he puts it. And so what does he do? Locke's major contribution, probably what you know him for, is his political philosophy. We're not really talking politics now, so we won't get into the details, but anybody familiar with John Locke at all? You've heard his name, maybe? I hope they talked about John Locke when he took government.
That class is over. I don't have to know that anymore.
Oh, jeez. Oh, gee. So John Locke, right, pretty much, the Declaration of Independence pretty much plagiarized from his second treatise on government, right? What does the Declaration of Independence say? That we all have the right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, right? For John Locke, it was the pursuit of property. Change one word. So, yeah. So that's John Locke. He was one of the first to actually start to challenge the divine right of kings. He started talking about the rights of man and things. And so that's his political thought, which is significant. But we're worried about his epistemology. One of his significant contributions to epistemology is the rejection of innate ideas. He doesn't believe in things called innate ideas. Remember, Descartes says that I have an innate idea of God. What does that mean, innate? It's already there, right? It's innate. It's there. Locke says there are no such things as innate ideas. All ideas come from experience. And so his philosophy of mind has come to be known as the blank slate theory. He believes that our mind, when we're born, is sort of this blank slate. And so we have a blank slate, tabula rasa, and when we see a chair for the first time and somebody points to it and says chair, we sort of draw a picture of a chair on that blank slate, put the word chair next to it, right? This is a crude explanation, but basically that's kind of what's going on. So the next time we see an object that looks kind of like it, we go back to our drawing and, okay, that was the thing called a chair. Okay. So that's sort of his explanation for how we come to know things and have knowledge. It's all based on experience. And one other thing that he did I think was pretty significant is he wasn't dealing with the things in themselves, but he was trying to talk about, in my experience, are there certain qualities that are primary to the object, and there might be other qualities that are secondary. So this notion of primary versus secondary qualities is something that originates in Locke. So again, according to Locke, experience, if I just limit myself to my own perceptions, I'll find that some qualities are primary while others are secondary. What kind of qualities are primary? He said things like density and shape. Those are primary qualities of an object. So I guess the density of this desk, of this lectern, and its shape are primary qualities. Whereas other qualities like its color and its taste, if it has a taste, I don't want to taste it, or its smell, right? Maybe if I can't smell anything, but maybe if I was a dog or something, I could smell, some traces of something on there, right? But those are secondary, right? Smell, color, taste, secondary, shape, and density, primary. Why would he privilege density and shape? Why are those more essential to my experience of this object? What do you mean by that, though? But can I measure color? I mean, by like a frequency spectrum or something like that. Physicists do that. Was it black is zero frequency, and then you've got this whole. So I guess quantitative. Taste might be hard to quantify, right? But I don't think necessarily that the others aren't hard to qualify. They're hard to qualify. But let's think about it this way. If I so smell is not a primary one. So let's just cover our nose. Color is not primary, so I close my eyes. The taste, right? I'm not going to eat anything, right? But wait, the shape is still the same, right? Even though I can't see it or anything like that, the density of it is the same. If I took it, let's imagine this desk here, this table, was perfectly white on the top, really bright white. And we put it into a dark room and shined a red light on it. Would it look like a white table anymore? No, it looked like a red table. And so it seems like the color of it might be dependent more on context. What's that?
He doesn't believe in, he doesn't believe in the senses. He believes something.
No, he does believe in the senses. The senses, we can learn through the senses. But he seems to think that things like color and taste and what was the other one? Color, taste, and the way that it will sound. Yeah, I didn't mention that. A smell, right? That these things, and even sound, now that I said it, these are more dependent on the individual. Right. Whereas the other one, like shape and density, are things that we all kind of have access to and we don't dispute. So let's just imagine I walk to school every day and I pass by a pizza parlor in the morning, right? And so I walk by the pizza parlor and I'm smelling all the wonderful food they're cooking, right? They're getting ready for the day, prepping things, baking bread, and they're making their sauces, so I smell a little garlic in the air, right? It just smells really delicious. Maybe I haven't had breakfast yet, so my stomach's kind of talking to me, and man, that smells good. I'm gonna have to come back here for lunch, get me a calzone or something. Well, that experience is going to be quite different from, let's say I go a week later and walk by this pizza place, but I've got a cold. My nose is all stopped up. I'm really sick. How is my experience going to change, right? Am I going to smell that cooking and be like, it's going to be completely different. But is the shape of the building going to change, or the density of the building going to change? No. So Locke seems to think that, when I'm sick, maybe you've been really sick and you had some food that's like your favorite food, but it doesn't have any flavor. It kind of tastes bland. You ever had that experience, right? So it seems like taste and color.
It's like objective things versus subjective things.
Yeah, sure, but I don't think he wants to use that term objective because that sort of makes it sound like a thing in itself, right? He said, well, I'm dealing with my experience still, but even though I'm just dealing with experience, it seems like there's more things that are more constant about the object, right? The shape and the density is constant, whereas the color, the smell, the taste, these depend on my condition.
But doesn't the shape also change? Not everything.
Sure. It's not that the desk couldn't change shape if I went and messed with it, right, and destroyed it, right? But as it stands now, right, my experience of it is that we were just looking at this desk, right, and I'm looking at it, and those halves retain a shape or a density, right? Whereas, let's say, sometimes you rub your eyes really hard and you look and there's all these dots and things like this, right? So that's dependent on you. It's not that there's actually dots out there, right? And so for Locke, these are more constant. It's not to say that shape doesn't change, but it's more constant and consistent than things like smell and taste. Do you have a comment or question?
Well, the primary seems like more like an infinite thought. Like, let's say, like you say, a chair.
Yeah.
You kind of have the idea of perception that it's a chair it's used to sit on. But what changes, you can't base it on, I guess. You said like the other senses, like hearing it, taste, and all that. Kind of like a vehicle coming at you, you can't really tell if you have your eyes open, but you know it's a car.
Okay, yeah. So it's a car, and that has maybe more to do with the shape or the form it takes or something like that, whereas the sound it makes isn't so essential to that aspect of it, right? Well, it makes a sound or it has a certain color, but so what? It's still a car. Even if I'm not looking at it, I hear it driving towards me. I know, oh, that sounds like a car. I know what kind it is. So, but now that kind of like goes back on the sound thing, though, I think, right? I mean, he says that sound is a secondary quality, but if it's true what you say about the car, cars have a very distinct sound. I don't know, I suppose maybe you could be fooled into thinking it was a car when it was really just a bulldozer or something like that, maybe, but usually not. But when we get to Berkeley, he doesn't really like this. He thinks it's silly to distinguish between qualities, that some are more important than others, because for Berkeley, ultimately, all of these inputs, if you want to call them that, they all end up in the same place. I mean, sure, I use my nose to smell, I use my eyes to see, my ears to hear, but where does all this information go eventually? My mind, right? He wouldn't say brain because he's not as scientific. He's thinking, he's still with Descartes, right? The mind is not something that is physical. So Berkeley's kind of odd. He thinks that for an empiricist, he's odd. He's not just an empiricist. He's also what you call an idealist, just like Plato was an idealist, but Berkeley's an idealist in a different sense. I mean, Plato was not an empiricist, but he was an idealist. And Berkeley says, look, all that exists, really, all we can really know for certain exist are ideas. Like all these physical things, they're just what we're experiencing, and we're experiencing them in our mind. And so when I'm seeing something, when I'm hearing something, I'm using my organs perhaps to do it, but eventually it all ends up here in my head, in my mind. And that's what we need to focus on. That's really the content of experience. And so why privilege, density? And why privilege these other things? They all boil down to perceptions of the mind for Berkeley. So no distinction is really necessary. And what does it mean when I say that there is a desk in the room? How do I know there's a desk in the room? What would Berkeley perhaps say? How do I know that I'm looking at a desk? Because I'm looking at it. Right? If somebody came to the door, knocked on the door here, I walk in, I open it, excuse me, can I help you? I just needed to know how many students are in your class right now. And they couldn't see in here, so I had to sort of look and count. Oh, there's 31 students in here. And they say, well, how do you know that? How do you know there are 31 students? Well, that's a pretty stupid question, but if I was going to answer it, what would I say? How do I know there are 31 students? I just counted them. I just looked at them, right? How do I know that they are? How do I know that they exist, that they have being? Because I perceive them. So for Berkeley, to exist, to be, as he puts it, is to be perceived. To be is to be an object of perception. That's what it means to exist. He writes in Latin, so the quote, et si is percepi. To be is to be perceived. What does the perceiving, the mind? So that makes him an idealist. He's not just an empiricist. Perception is basically reality, but he's also an idealist. To be is to be perceived, but what perceives? The mind. So everything that is just an idea in some mind somewhere. But wait a minute, this seems kind of weird, because if to be is to be perceived, then what happens at the end of the day? bump into Marcus or something at the grocery store later today, and he starts joking, so I guess our classroom disappeared, Well, Berkeley might say, well, you're thinking about it. You just said our classroom, that idea of classroom's in your head, so it's still there. It's being perceived by your mind. But even that's kind of silly, because for that to work, he wants to say that these things stay here. They don't just disappear. It's not like, hey, everybody stare at this side of the room. Now that side disappears. No. He knows that's ridiculous. So he's got to explain this. And he couldn't say that, well, you're thinking about it at one point during the day, so now it does exist. Because for that to work, everybody, or at least one person, would have to be thinking about the classroom at every point of time. And not just the classroom in general, but everything in it. The chalkboard, and the speakers, and this screen, projector, and all this. So that's kind of ridiculous. But he wants to say it's still here. Well, how can it be here if no one's perceiving it? Well, someone is perceiving it, or some being is perceiving it. Unlike Locke, unlike Hume, Berkeley was pretty religious. He was actually, he was a priest. So, bishop, he was a bishop. Bishop Berkeley. So what do you think his solution for this problem will be? God is perceiving it. Right. So God is this sort of divine perceiver who perceives everything. So when a tree falls in the woods and no one's there to hear it, it does make a sound because God heard it. Right? So that's the end of that story there. But I think there's a bit of a problem here also with Berkeley too. There's other things in the world that we don't perceive, but yet we take for granted. I think this was also a problem for Descartes. We mentioned it earlier today. What are the things? What am I talking about? Things that I take for granted. I take for granted that they exist, but I don't see them. Never could see them. It's impossible to see them. And I think all of you have one. A mind. I think you have a mind, and so do I perceive your mind? No. So how do I know you have one? For Berkeley, he says, and this is sort of his solution to that problem, solipsism. How do I get beyond just knowing myself? For Berkeley, he says, well, I don't really have an idea or a concept of another mind. Right? That would be impossible because I don't perceive it. But then he mentions there are other things that he calls notions, which are a little bit less strong than ideas or concepts. And he says, I don't have an idea or a concept of another mind besides my own, but I have a notion of it. And where does this notion come from? It's just an analogy that I make. I look at a person, I see them staring at certain things, and I just make an analogy. Oh, if I was sitting in that seat, looking at this angle, I would see the classroom this way, right? So again, it's a bit of an analogy that I make, and I'll never be sure of the other mind, but I have a notion that's a pretty strong notion, he says, as strong a notion as can be. But also, what about God? Do I ever perceive God? So how do I know God exists? This divine perceiver. That's another problem for Berkeley. And I don't know if I like his answer to that question, but it's pretty much like you hear some people who are very religious make this appeal sometimes. If they come across an atheist or an agnostic, they might say, well, how could you not believe in God? How could you possibly not believe in God? Look. What do they mean by that?
Who created this?
Right. Something must have created this, and only thing that could have, that was powerful enough was God. So God's the only answer to that, and that's pretty much what Berkeley says. When we get to Hume, we'll see why that's not such a good argument. We probably might take us a couple days to get to that point of Hume, but Hume's got an attack on Berkeley, which is, I guess, another thing about Hume that makes him pretty unique. Not only was he critical of the rationalist, obviously, he's an empiricist, but Hume was also pretty critical of his own guys. He thought Locke and Berkeley were on the right track, but even they made mistakes. And so, David Hume was the type that, I don't know if he really wanted to invite controversy because, some of his work wasn't published until after his death. He knew it was very controversial. I don't know if he wanted to invite controversy, but he certainly did invite controversy, and he wasn't really taken very seriously as a philosopher during his own lifetime. Right? He was actually quite reviled during his own lifetime. He was pretty successful as a historian. He wrote a history of the British Empire, or the history of England, actually, that was a very successful academic publication. And it was sort of the standard for history courses for a while. So he had fame and renown as a historian, but it really wasn't until Kant read Hume that people started taking him seriously, right? And so Kant is the last figure that we're going to look at in Unit 2, but we got to get through Hume first. And, question?
Yeah, I do. Could you go back and kind of talk about notion? What did you mean?
Notion, okay, so Berkeley says there are certain things that he calls ideas or concepts, and so I have an idea or a concept of the female body, right? Why? Because I've seen a female body, right? I've perceived it. And so because I perceived it, I'm able to come up with a concept or an idea in my head. But he says, I don't see a mind, so I don't have a concept of it. I don't have an idea. I have what he calls a notion. And really, to me, this is kind of just him making crap up. It's like, sort of like, well, I know that I acknowledge other people's minds, but it doesn't really fit my system. Because I've already said to be is to be perceived.
I guess.
So I know that, go ahead, yeah?
Well, I was going to say, because today, in the way we think, mind and brain are synonymous.
Right.
When we talk about a brain, we're still talking about somebody's mind.
Right. And he's not that way. Now, Hume might be, or at least Hume might be leaning towards our understanding, where brain and mind are synonymous, right? He's calling for naturalism. That's what that is. It's a natural phenomenon, right? Berkeley is still sort of trapped with Descartes' view of the mind, right? He's an idealist, right? The mind is not something physical, right?
It's unextended.
It's unextended, exactly. So that's what makes him an idealist, which is really odd to be an idealist and an empiricist, right? Because he's going to talk about perceptions and senses, but they all boil down to images in our mind, right? Not physical things. Although they feel physical and all this stuff, they're being experienced by the mind, and that's its primary, right? So that's Berkeley in a nutshell. But Hume, right? You need to write about Hume or Descartes. Actually, you need to write about both Descartes and Hume, but focus on the one who you agree with the most. Before I let you go, though, I want to give you a little bit of a head start with Hume. That way you won't be completely lost when you go to read Hume. The Hume reading is actually on the website. Okay, so you'll need to go there. There's 2 files. One of them's a bit longer than the other one. The other file is just like 2 pages or something at the very end. But remember, Descartes' argument for rationalism, at least the one that we were given here in class, was the wax example, right? He showed that my knowledge of the wax has to be based on my reasoning. It can't be based on my senses. Well, Hume's argument, I'm not going to get into the details of it until next time, but basically the gist of it, for Hume, there is no idea without a precedent experience of the thing. So all of my ideas, all of my notion and thoughts are based on something that I've previously experienced. And why does he say this? He says, well, it's almost like an appeal. It's not really an argument. It's sort of like, well, can you point to something, some idea that you have that wasn't based on previous experience? And he says, really, ultimately, you cannot. Anything that you're going to throw at me, I will tell you where it came from. Where did that idea come from? Don't care how fantastic it is. It was based on something you experienced before. And another appeal that he makes, he says, well, ask yourself this. If you've never experienced something, then how are you going to know about it? If you've never, let's imagine you meet somebody who's never tasted an avocado. And they want to know what it tastes like. But they're not going to taste it. They want you to explain to them what it tastes like. What would you tell them? That it tastes what? You've got to taste it to know. Right? Has anybody here not had an avocado before? You've never tasted? Never had guacamole? Then you can know what it tastes like. You had guacamole. It's avocado mashed up with a little seasoning, usually thrown in some salt and maybe some lemon juice. Sometimes I add tomatoes and onions and cilantro. I don't like that. I like just plain. A little salt, maybe a little lemon juice. That's it. But if you taste this guacamole, you probably know, at least you have an idea of what avocado tastes like. breast is almost like red meat. You know, it's almost like a steak, but then the legs are kind of like white meat chicken. So now you kind of maybe have an idea of what it tastes like. But that's based on a previous experience. Your experience of eating chicken, your experience of eating red meat, you know, beef or something. So an avocado has a very unique flavor, though, right? I mean, what tastes like an avocado?
An avocado.
Yeah, an avocado, right? So Hume's going to say, look, that idea of avocado flavor, which you all have in your head, if you think about it, I know what an avocado tastes like, based on your experience of tasting one. And that's how all of our thoughts come, at least according to Hume. All of our thoughts originate in experience. And so when you go to do your paper, right, just think about these arguments and, you know, pick one out. Who do you buy? Who do you agree with? Who's got a better case for their epistemology? And that will be due next class. Okay. All right, guys, have a good couple days. I'll see you Thursday.